Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello, welcome back. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've had a wonderful week. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host of The Bitter Witness. I'm starting to get the hang of this editing thing, and I'm hoping that very soon it won't sound like I'm continually talking, and I'm going to get the editing thing nailed, I promise. If you enjoy this show, please go over to our Patreon page and support us. Your support is what allows us to continue making these shows. For $3 a month, you can become an Eyewitness tier member. You will have access to exclusive content, specifically the Bitter Bits, which are shorter episodes. This is a horrific crime. So, trigger warning, this case talks about murder, torture, and robbery. The dogs are sleeping behind me. Both Miley and Piper will be supplying our ASMR today. So, grab a cup of tea, sit back and relax while I tell you about the case of the HiFi Shop Murders. As always, I want to give the victims in this case top billing. So, Michelle, Stanley, Courtney, Orrin, and Carol, I acknowledge you and I send my love to you wherever you may be. Ogden, Utah, which is about 40 minutes north of Salt Lake City, is nestled between the Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake. All in all, Ogden was, and still is, a beautiful city. The Hill Air Force Base was about a 5-minute drive from the HiFi Shop. On Monday, April 22nd, 1974, Sherry Michelle Ainsley, who went by Michelle, aged 18 years old, and Stanley Walker, 20 years old, were working that night inside the HiFi Shop. Michelle had only been hired at the shop 1 week earlier, and at the time of the murders, she was planning her wedding, which was scheduled for August 5th of that year. According to reports, Michelle was a cheerful and outgoing girl who was always supportive of her friends. Stanley has been described as a wonderful young man. He was an elder in his church, a branch of the LDS Church, Latter-day Saints, as well as a basketball coach and a mentor to younger men within his faith. Byron Courtney Nesbitt, age 16, went by the name Courtney. Courtney was still attending high school, shared a love of scouting with his father, and won several awards for it. He loved science, and at one point he actually built a telescope from scratch. He ground a mirror and silvered it all by himself. He came into the shop that afternoon and asked if it was okay if he left his car in the HiFi Shop's parking lot while he ran next door to the photo lab to run an errand. It would only take a few minutes. Stanley told Courtney it was absolutely fine, and Courtney thanked him and exited the HiFi Shop to go run his errand. Courtney also loved flying, and on April 22nd, 1974, he had completed his first solo flight right before he attended the HiFi Shop. Immediately after Courtney left the shop, 2 vans pulled up and parked at the back door of the HiFi Shop. Inside the vans were 6 men. 4 of the men exited the vans. 2 men stayed inside the vans, 1 in each van, both in the driver's seats with the engines running. One of the drivers was Keith Leon Roberts, 19 years old. One of the 4 that exited the vans stayed outside the back door of the store, most likely as a lookout and also waiting to help load the stolen stereo equipment into the 2 waiting vans. The 3 remaining men made their way around to the front door of the HiFi Shop. These 3 were William Andrews, 19 years old, Pierre Dale Selby, 21 years old, and a 3rd man who still remains unknown to this day. The 3 identified men were all stationed at Hill Air Force Base. The men burst into the HiFi Shop with guns drawn. They quickly gained control over the 2 employees and forced them down to the basement of the store. There they bound both Michelle and Stanley. Then the 3 men proceeded to rob the store, taking everything out through the back door to the waiting vans. After a few minutes, Courtney Nesbitt re-entered the store. He wanted to thank Stanley again for allowing him to park in the HiFi Shop's parking lot while he ran his errand. As soon as he entered the store, he was very quickly taken hostage by Selby. Courtney was taken down to the basement and bound the same as Michelle and Stanley. After some time, and we don't exactly know how long, but if I had to guess, I would say probably an hour or so, Orrin Walker, Stanley's father, was growing concerned because his son had not come home after his shift. Orrin decided to head down to the HiFi shop to see if Stanley was still there, and if he was still there, to see what was happening. Like the others, as soon as Orrin entered the store looking for his son, he was immediately taken hostage and forced down to the basement and bound. Now the robbers had 4 hostages in the basement, all bound, and they continued robbing the store, hauling out as much equipment as possible to the vans. Sometime after Orrin was taken hostage, and again, we aren't certain about the amount of time in between any of these events, Courtney's mother, Carol Peterson Nesbitt, was getting worried about Courtney as he hadn't come home from running his quick errand to the photo lab. Carol decided to go out and look for her son. She spotted his car in the HiFi Shop's parking lot and decided to go see if she could find him. First, Carol went to the photo lab, but it was closed. Then she saw that the HiFi Shop was still open. As soon as Carol entered the store, she was also taken hostage and forced down to the basement and bound just like the others. Now the hostage count was up to 5 people. Selby and Andrews were in the basement with the hostages. According to Orrin, they were pacing back and forth, and Selby was quite angry at this point. Selby then instructed Andrews to go out to the van and get something and bring it in. Andrews left while Selby kept watch over the hostages. Andrews returned carrying a brown paper bag with some type of bottle inside. Now, according to Orrin, when Andrews returned, the bottle was inside the brown paper bag. According to Selby, he found this bottle inside the bathroom of the basement of the HiFi Shop. I personally believe Orrin that Andrews went out to the van and retrieved the bottle. Selby took the bottle from the bag and poured a cup of blue liquid. Selby and Andrews told the hostages it was vodka laced with sleeping pills, and that once everyone had drunk the concoction, it would give the robbers enough of a head start to get away, as they would all be asleep. But it wasn't vodka laced with sleeping pills. It was Drano. Andrews and Selby then propped up each hostage and proceeded to force them to drink the Drano. Everyone except for Michelle. Selby and Andrews had other plans for Michelle. Michelle began pleading and crying for her life, begging Selby and Andrews to stop and just let everyone go. But Selby and Andrews were immune to Michelle's pleadings and continued force-feeding the Drano to the other hostages. Michelle became more and more terrified as she saw what was happening to the other hostages as they were forced to drink the Drano. The instant the Drano touched the lips of each hostage, the Drano formed huge blisters on their lips and faces. It instantly burned the insides of their mouths and throats. The Drano began to eat away the flesh from the lips and surrounding flesh. The hostages instantly began screaming and crying in pain and trying to spit the Drano out of their mouths. Selby and Andrews were enraged that the hostages weren't swallowing the Drano, so they attempted to duct tape shut the mouths of the hostages. However, with the amount of pus that oozed from the blisters and the flesh being eaten away, it prevented the duct tape from sticking to the mouths of the hostages. You see, the active ingredient in Drano is sodium hydroxide, which is also known as lye or caustic soda. Orrin Walker, Stanley's father, was the last hostage forced to drink the Drano. After seeing what was happening to the other hostages from the liquid in the cup, he allowed the horrid blue liquid to enter his mouth, but then he made it dribble out the side. He then proceeded to scream and convulse as some of the other hostages had started to do. Selby became enraged that the deaths of the hostages was taking so long, and it was so messy and they were so loud. Selby had specifically chosen this method of death because In the movie Magnum Force, a sex worker was given Drano by her pimp, and she immediately died quietly and with no fuss in the back of a taxi. However, here in real life, that was not the case. With his rage seething at the noise and mess in front of him, Selby pulled out his gun and shot Carol and Courtney Nesbitt in the backs of their head. Next, he took aim at Orrin Walker, but missed his target. Most likely enraged from the missed shot, Selby pointed his gun at Stanley Walker, Orrin's son, and shot Stanley, killing him. Once Stanley was killed, Selby turned his gun back to Orrin, who had just witnessed his son's murder, and shot Orrin in the back of the head. Selby then grabbed a screaming, crying Michelle Ainsley and dragged her to a corner of the basement, where he pointed his gun at her face and told her to remove all her clothing. While Michelle was removing her clothing, Selby instructed Andrews to leave the basement and come back in 30 minutes. Selby then repeatedly raped Michelle. When he was finished, he dragged Michelle back over to the now pile of dead bodies and threw her face down on the pile and shot her in the back of the head, killing her instantly. Throughout all of this killing and rape spree by Selby, Andrews stood to the side and watched the horror unfold. After Selby had killed Michelle, he and Andrews realized that someone was still alive. They searched the bodies and found that Orrin had survived the shot to the back of the head. Selby, even more enraged that Orrin had somehow survived, climbed onto the back of Orrin and placed a piece of wire around his neck and pulled as hard as he could. However, no matter how hard Selby pulled, Orrin would not die. So Selby and Andrews took a ballpoint pen and inserted the pen into Orrin's ear. Selby then stomped on Orrin's ear and the pen repeatedly until the pen was protruding from the side of Orrin's throat. Selby and Andrews were now convinced that the pen had managed to kill Orrin, so they left the basement and headed back up to the sales floor. They stole a few more pieces of equipment, then hopped in the vans and drove away. Approximately 4 hours later, Orrin Walker's wife, Joyce, and their other son, Lynn, made their way to the HiFi Shop. Now they were looking for both Orrin and Stanley, as neither one of them had arrived home. Once they arrived at the store, the front door was locked, but both Orrin and Stanley's cars were in the parking lot. So Joyce and Lynn made their way around to the back of the building. There, they heard sounds coming from the basement of the store. Lynn immediately started battering the back door of the shop to try and bust it down, and Joyce called 911. Once they got inside, they discovered the gruesome scene in the basement. Sadly, Stanley and Michelle were dead. Carol Nesbitt was clinging to life. Courtney and Orrin were also still alive, but barely. Carol, Courtney, and Orrin were rushed to the hospital. Unfortunately, Carol passed away once she arrived at the hospital, but Orrin and Courtney were still clinging to life. The doctors did not hold out much hope for Courtney. His poor little body was suffering from so much trauma from all of his injuries. However, miraculously, after 266 days in the hospital, Courtney was able to go home. Although he had severe and permanent brain damage, lasting burn injuries to his stomach and his esophagus. Nurse Ladora Davidson stated in an interview that when the nurses on the floor saw the stress and despair on both Courtney and his family, it only made them want to work harder to make Courtney better. She stated that there were many times during the 266 days when they weren't sure if Courtney was going to live through his recovery. In an interview after his release from hospital, Courtney sat on his couch with his wife Kathy by his side. The report stated that Courtney lived in daily pain and he was sometimes unable to express the thoughts that were inside his mind. Courtney stated in this interview that he lost himself, his identity, and that they affixed a new identity to him that not many people could associate with. His wife Kathy stated that Courtney couldn't wear a watch for ages because he couldn't stand anything around his wrists. She said that it was just a day-to-day hell, and she stated that Courtney was one of the most fantastic and gifted people that she'd ever known. To see all this happening in this man was hell in itself. Orrin survived with severe burns to his stomach and esophagus, a gunshot wound to the head, and the injury to his ear and throat. Despite his injuries, Orrin was able to give the police a brief description of the two men who committed the murders. He told the police that the man who did the shooting was a short-statured black man with a Caribbean accent, and he wore glasses. Orrin only had a vague description of the second man, as that man had very little to do with the torture of the victims, and he didn't shoot anyone. Orrin could only describe him as a black man, a little taller than the other man. A few hours after the news broke about the murders, an airman from Hill Air Force Base called the police and informed them that a fellow airman, 19-year-old William Andrews, had told him a few months before that one of these days I'm going to rob that HiFi shop, and if anyone gets in the way, I'm going to kill him. A few hours after the anonymous airman called in the first tip, a couple of teenage boys were hanging out by Hill Air Force Base, and they decided to dive into the dumpsters to see if they could find anything interesting. Once inside the dumpster, they found a bunch of purses and wallets near the bottom of the dumpster. The boys opened the wallets and immediately recognized the faces and names on the identification. The IDs were all from the victims of the HiFi Shop Murders. The boys immediately called 911 and reported to the police what they had found. Police immediately arrived and secured the dumpster and surrounding area. Naturally, a large group of airmen started to congregate around the dumpster, trying to see what was going on. Selby and Andrews were also in that group of men. Detective Deloy White arrived on the scene and noticed the large crowd of airmen. Wondering if the killers might actually be in that crowd, he decided to see if he could flush them out. He approached the dumpster and began speaking loudly and dramatically. He then reached into the dumpster with a pair of tongs and retrieved a piece of evidence and began waving it around in the air and yelling about the evidence. While Detective White was putting on his show, he noticed that the majority of the crowd of airmen were standing absolutely quiet and still, just staring at him, all except for two in the very back of the crowd. The two airmen at the back of the crowd were pacing back and forth, yelling loudly at each other and waving their hands in the air. The two airmen were Selby and Andrews. The police took Selby and Andrews in for questioning. While they were being questioned, the police executed a search warrant on the two men's barracks. During the search, they found flyers for the HiFi shop and a contract for a rental of a storage unit that was located not too far from the HiFi shop. The police were able to obtain another search warrant for the storage unit. Once they opened the unit, they found the stereo equipment that had been stolen from the HiFi shop. This was confirmed with the serial numbers on the equipment. Selby and Andrews were immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. A few weeks after Selby and Andrews were arrested and charged, Keith Roberts, also an airman at Hill Air Force Base, was arrested. According to reports, at some time during the many interviews and interrogations, one or both of Selby and Andrews revealed Roberts' name as an accomplice. Roberts was charged with first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. Now let's get into some background on Selby and Andrews, as they are the two main perpetrators of the murders. Dale Pierre, also known as Pierre Dale Selby, was born on the Isle of Tobago in 1952, but grew up on the Isle of Trinidad. Selby was always in trouble growing up for something. He was a compulsive liar, and he had a temper that he was not able to control. If Selby didn't get what he wanted when he wanted it, there was going to be trouble. However, he never showed his anger side to his parents. They knew nothing about it. In June 1970, Selby left Trinidad and Tobago for the U.S. He lived in Brooklyn until May of 1973, when he joined the United States Air Force. He was assigned to Hill Air Force Base in Utah as a helicopter mechanic. Shortly after Selby arrived at the Hill Air Force Base, he became a suspect in the murder of Sergeant Edward Jefferson. Jefferson was found in his own apartment, murdered by a bayonet. The following are the details of the murder of Sergeant Edward Jefferson. On Sunday, October 1st, 1973, Selby had been at Jefferson's apartment taping music when Jefferson discovered that his car keys were missing. The two men thoroughly searched the house, but they couldn't find the keys. It wasn't until the next day that the keys were found. Apparently, Selby stole the keys to have them duplicated. When Selby duplicated the keys, he signed the name Curtis Alexander in an attempt to conceal that it was him that had stolen them. Then Selby returned to Jefferson's apartment to continue helping him find his keys, and miraculously, the keys appeared. Sergeant Jefferson immediately became suspicious of Selby and changed the locks to his apartment and changed his ignition. When Jefferson confronted Selby, Selby denied everything. Sometime between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., Sergeant Edward Jefferson was murdered with a bayonet. Whoever killed Sergeant Jefferson, and it is believed that Selby was the perpetrator, had jammed the knife so deep into Sergeant Jefferson's face and head that only the handle could be seen. But there wasn't enough evidence to arrest Selby or convict him, and the case remained unsolved until Selby and Andrews were brought to trial for the HiFi Shop Murders. I couldn't find any corroboration of this, but I believe that Selby actually confessed to Sergeant Jefferson's murder once he was convicted in the HiFi Shop Murders. William Andrews. William Andrews was born in Virginia in 1953. He had a basically normal upbringing, and by all accounts, he was a pretty well-behaved kid. He joined the Air Force in 1973, the same time as Selby, and was also assigned to Hill Air Force Base, also as a helicopter mechanic. Life on the base for the two men was weird and different for both of them. There was quite a divide between Selby and Andrews. Selby was a loner. No one wanted to be friends with him because of his attitude and the fact that his anger just was explosive. On the other hand, Andrews was well liked by his fellow airmen. He had quite a few friends and was quite popular. However, once he became best friends with Selby, the other friends started removing themselves from the circle. In 1974, both men filed for separation from the Air Force to their commanding officer. The two men had had enough of the Air Force. According to many reports, this heist of the stereo equipment was supposed to finance their life after the Air Force. A joint trial was held for all three men, which began on October 15, 1974. During the trial, Orrin Walker was able to take the stand and testify against the men. Courtney, however, was unable to testify as he was suffering from amnesia from the violence he had suffered, but his father, Byron Nesbitt, did testify at the trial. Selby and Andrews were both convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. Both were sentenced to death. Roberts was acquitted of the murder charges as he was the getaway driver and had never entered the store or had any interaction with the victims. In a jailhouse interview, Andrews stated that the plan was always to take the money and run. He also stated that both of the men were finishing up their terms at the base and were planning on leaving the state. Andrews also stated that he knew Stanley Walker and that he liked him. However, despite this apparent fondness of Stanley, Andrews didn't do anything to save him. Andrews stated that he didn't kill anyone, that he only held the gun and the cup during the robbery, and that Selby poured the Drano into the cup, and then that it was Selby who handed the cup to the victims. Andrews states that he didn't think the Drano would kill any of the victims. Prosecutors say that's not true. They say that just by Andrews' statements in this interview alone, that Andrews actually implicated himself in the murders. The prosecutors absolutely believed that the Drano was intended to kill the victims and that Andrews knew that. During the interviews, Andrews stated that he was informed by Selby that the Drano hadn't worked. Just that statement alone suggests that Andrews knew what the Drano was intended for. However, Andrews stuck to his claim until his last day, saying that he told Selby he couldn't kill anyone and that he left the shop, and when he left the shop, no one was dead. However, the jury did not believe him. Selby claims they never intended to kill anyone during the robbery, just that things got out of control and he had no other choice but to kill the victims. Again, the jury didn't buy that. Both of the men were convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. Roberts was acquitted of the murder charge, but was convicted on aggravated robbery. 13 years after the horrific murders at the HiFi Shop, on August 28, 1987, Selby was put to death by lethal injection. He was brought to a sterile room and gently placed on a gurney and put to sleep before the drugs that were being injected into his arm stopped his heart. Nothing like the horror and torture and pain that his victims suffered. Prior to his execution, Selby stated that he was a changed man and that he had found God. When asked if he had any last words, he stated, "Thank you, I'm just going to say my prayers. I'll be glad when this is over." 18 years after the murder, on July 30th, 1992, 5 years after Selby was executed, Andrews was put to death, also by lethal injection. And also like Selby, there was no screaming or crying or begging for his life as his victims had done. Andrews was simply put to sleep. His last words, "Thank those who tried so hard to keep me alive. I hope they continue to fight for equal justice after I'm gone. Tell my family goodbye and I love them." After being strapped onto the gurney, Andrews lifted his head and said to his sister, "I love you. Bye-bye." Roberts received 5 years to life and was paroled on May 12, 1987. Serving almost 13 years in prison, he moved to Oklahoma to live with family. Roberts died by suicide on August 8, 1992, 1 week after Andrews' execution. As for the other 3 men in the robbery, their identities were never revealed by Selby, Roberts, or Andrews. They were never caught or identified. They literally got away with their crime. Now, this case incited huge racial tensions in Utah, specifically surrounding Andrews' conviction and sentence. Andrews claimed he didn't know that Selby planned to murder anyone. He stated that he thought they were just there to steal stereo equipment. The NAACP and Amnesty International became involved, citing that both Selby and Andrews were denied a fair trial by a jury of their peers, because the entire jury that convicted them was white. There had been a black juror earlier in the process of jury selection, however, they had been dismissed early on. But it was later revealed that that particular juror was actually a law enforcement officer and knew almost everyone involved in the case, which I personally find very interesting that he was even called as a potential juror. Usually people who work in law enforcement are never called. Even someone like me who has a bachelor's and a master's in criminology most likely would never be called for jury duty. According to many of my professors, because I've asked about this, because I've always wanted to serve on a jury. I know, I'm weird. My professors always told me that we have too much knowledge of the criminal justice system itself, as well as too much insight into the motivation of criminal behavior. For that reason alone, we wouldn't be considered a peer of an alleged offender. So I guess I'm not going to get called for jury duty, but I do find it interesting that this police officer was called. The NAACP and Amnesty International called upon all sources to commute Selby and Andrews' death sentences to life without parole, but these calls went on deaf ears. In an interview for a local news channel, one of the detectives involved in the case said that this case wasn't about race. It was about the brutality of the crime and that it just happened to be committed by 2 black men. He said that if 2 white men committed the same crime, they would receive the death penalty just the same. This kind of thing has always fascinated me because you get into cultural information with these kinds of arguments about fair jury selection and being tried by a jury of your peers. For every culture there are different standards, there are different beliefs, there are different morals. I would love to see what the outcome would be of an entire black jury deciding the fate of Selby and Andrews. I'm curious to see if they would actually both still receive the death penalty or not. It would be an interesting experiment. It could never happen, but it would be an interesting experiment. On July 27th, 1992, just 3 days before Andrews' execution date, a petition for a stay of Andrews' execution was submitted to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Sadly, it wasn't until December of 1996 that the Inter-American Commission found that the United States had violated its international obligations by denying William Andrews a trial free from racial discrimination. The Commission recommended that the United States must provide adequate compensation to Mr. William Andrews' next of kin for the violation. However, I wasn't able to find anything stating whether that compensation took place or will take place. I have my own opinions on this case, and I believe that Selby went there with the preconceived notion that if anyone was in the shop or arrived at the shop during the robbery, that he would kill them. I don't think he ever even had a second thought about it. Andrews, on the other hand, I'm a little conflicted. I don't feel that he deserved the death penalty. He never actually killed anyone. Did he torture? Absolutely. Was that torture horrific? Absolutely. Did he deserve life in prison without parole? Again, absolutely. I don't want to boil this case down to race. I want to keep it focused on what happened to these victims. Now remember that all the details that we've discussed today have come from either one of the victims or from the two perpetrators. So when we break it down, how reliable is this information? Information from the victim? Pretty reliable. But due to the extreme nature of the torture and injuries that he suffered, could he possibly have misremembered a few details? Sure. But for the most part, I believe that what Orrin Walker said was absolute truth. Details from the perpetrators, I take with a huge pile of salt, maybe even the entire salt mine. I hate the death penalty in cases like this. I think that the death penalty should be considered on a case-by-case basis, but where should the line be drawn for who is eligible for a death sentence? Should they stay at an eye for an eye? Is that where the line should be drawn? Or should they pull the line all the way back and say, well, if the torture was horrific enough, then yeah, they should be eligible too. Or maybe the line is just that they were there even though they didn't kill anyone. That's the problem I have with the death penalty case. Another problem I have with the death penalty case is, what if you make a mistake? What if you weren't fair when handing down the sentence of death? Death is pretty final, and there's no takesies backsies, you know? So if you screw up in handing down the death penalty and carrying it out, what then? Oops, sorry? That doesn't work very well for the person who's now dead. Do I think that Selby and Andrews received a fair trial? No. There was no jury members that represented their peers, their culture. There should have been way more diversity on that jury. This case is one that leaves a lot of questions. Who were the other three men? Why did Selby, Andrews, and Roberts go to the grave protecting their identities? Did those three men have something over Selby, Andrews, and Roberts? Were they higher up in the Air Force and had power over them? If I was being sentenced to death, I would tell everyone who the other people were. I'm going to die. What are they going to do? There's nothing more severe than receiving the death penalty. What do you have to lose? But I think we need to not allow the arrests and the convictions and the issues that are raised from those to wipe out the actual brutality of these crimes. Courtney Nesbitt suffered throughout his entire life with pain and disabilities from his injuries. He passed away on June 4th, 2002, at the very young age of 44. His father, Byron Nesbitt, still living in Ogden, declined to comment except to say, "This is the end of the HiFi story. I want this to be the end of it." Orrin Walker passed away on February 2000. He was 69 years old. This is a horrific murder. This is a horrific crime. And it does bring up a lot of racial tensions and a lot of questions about fair trials and death penalties. And no matter what Andrews and Selby said after they were arrested, those were the only two perpetrators in that basement. I hope you enjoyed listening to that case. I hope you'll join me again next week for our next case. Please remember, if you enjoyed this episode, please go to our Patreon page. That is what allows us to continue making these episodes for you. Thank you for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful week. Enjoy your day today. If you or anyone you know is being abused or hurt in any way, please reach out. There is help for you out there. This has been a Bitter Witness production.